Hello everyone and welcome to Mythstory, the show where we talk about myths from around the globe. For today's show, we're going to be discussing one of the most iconic religions that has ever existed, Egyptian mythology. For thousands of years, Egypt was a powerhouse. Their mythology was incredibly detailed, and their gods motivated almost every endeavor in the lives of the Egyptians. There is no way to fit the entire history of Egyptian mythology into one video. Although the Egyptian religion is generally known as being polytheistic, Egypt was the first civilization to try monotheism. It didn't work out well for them, and it's not what people usually mean when they talk about Egyptian mythology. Our earliest text shows about 200 gods, while later versions show about 500. Their pantheon of gods expanded so rapidly that modern scholarship still, to this day, has a tough time keeping up. But for today, we'll cover the most popular myths that permeated the Egyptian religion. Let's begin from the beginning. Creation. There are several accounts of the creation of the world and of man, but for the sake of simplicity, we will only be talking about a very minimalistic version of their creation story. In the beginning, there was Nu, a dark, watery abyss. From this abyss rose Atum, later to be called Ra. Becoming aware of his purpose as a god, he created land. Atum masturbated, and poured his seed into his mouth, and spat out Shu, the god of the air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. He proclaimed that one god had become three. He wept with joy at the creation of his children, and his tears formed the first people. A splurge of creation had begun. His children created Seb, the god of the earth, and Nut, the goddess of the sky. Atum, pleased with how creation was going, started to come forth as the plants and the animals. This council of gods would go on to create all the other gods: Isis, Osiris, Set, and Horus. The people were to worship the gods, and the gods, in return, would protect the people. Horus battles with Set. A few hundred years after creation, a war broke out between Set and Ra. Set had rebelled against him and even killed Osiris. During this war, Horus came to Ra for help locating him, for Horus had his own bone to pick with Set. He entered into the presence of Thoth, the twice-great god of magic, and Thoth gave him the power to change himself into a great winged disc, a disc that glowed like a ball of fire, with great wings on either side like the colors of the sky at sunset when the blue shades from dark to light, and is shot with golden flame. Thus Horus, as a great winged disc, sat on the prow of the boat of Ra, and his splendor flashed across the waters and fell upon his foes as they lay in ambush. Upon his glorious wings he rose into the air, and against his crafty enemies he made a curse terrible and fear-striking, saying, "Your eyes shall be blinded, and ye shall not see, and your eyes shall be deaf, and ye shall not hear." And at once, when each man looked at his neighbor, he saw a stranger, and when he heard his own familiar mother tongue, it sounded like a foreign language, and they cried out that they were betrayed, and that the enemy had come among them. They turned their weapons against each other, and in the quickness of a moment, many had ceased to live, and the rest had fled, while over them flew the gleaming disc, watching for Set. But Set was in the marshes of the north country, and these were but his guards. This was the first encounter between Set's army and Horus. Then the associates of Set came together and took counsel, and took upon themselves the likeness of crocodiles and hippopotamuses. For these great beasts can live under water, and no human weapon can pierce their hides. They came up the river, the water swirling behind them, and rushed upon the boat of Ra to overturn it. But Horus had gathered together his band of armorers and weaponsmiths, and they had prepared arrows and spears of metal, smelted and welded, hammered and shaped, with magical words and spells chanted over them. When the fierce beasts came up the river in waves of foam, the followers of Horus drew their bowstrings and let fly their arrows. They cast their javelins and charged with their spears. Many of Set's men were slain in this battle. This was the second encounter. There would be many more fights, and Horus would walk away the victor in all of them. But this didn't deter Set. He had his mind set on defeating both Horus and Ra. Now some say that the last great battle is still to come, and that in the end Horus will kill Set, and that Osiris and all the gods will reign on earth when their enemy is utterly destroyed. But others say that the battle has already ended, and that Horus slew the great and wicked foe who had brought misery and calamity to all. And this is what they say. After months and years, Horus the child grew to manhood. Then came Set with his allies, and he challenged Horus in the presence of Ra. And Horus came forth, his followers with him in their boats, with their armor, and their glittering weapons with handles of worked wood, and their cords and their spears. Then Set took upon himself the form of a red hippopotamus, great and mighty, and he came from the south land with his allies, traveling to the northland to meet Horus. Set stood up and spoke a great curse against Horus and against Isis, and said, "Let there come a great wind, even a furious north wind, and a raging tempest." And the sound of his voice was like thunder in the east of the sky. His words were cried from the southern heaven and rolled back to the northern heaven. A word and a cry from Set, the enemy of Osiris and the gods. At once a storm broke over the boats of Horus and his followers. The wind roared, and the water was lashed into great waves, and the boats were tossed like straws. But Horus held on his way, and through the darkness of the storm and the foam of the waves gleamed the golden prow like the rays of the sun. And Horus took upon himself the form of a young man. In his hand he held a harpoon. He held it over his head and launched it at the great red hippopotamus, which stood in the deep waters, ready to destroy Horus and his followers when the storm should wreck their boats. And at the first cast, the weapon struck deep into the head of the great red hippopotamus and entered the brain. Thus died Set, the great and wicked one, the enemy of Osiris and the gods. The Black Pig. Between Horus and Set, there is enmity and hatred, war and battle. Ever the fight goes on, and the combatants rage furiously, and victory is not yet declared to either. Now Set is cunning and crafty, and seeks to conquer by subtlety rather than by courage and skill in the fray, and such power is his that he can take what form he will and deceive both men and gods. This is the power of Set, but the power of Horus is not the same. For to Horus belong righteousness and truth. Deceit and falsehood are not in him. Whoso gazes into the blue eyes of Horus can see the future reflected there, and both gods and men seek Horus to learn what shall come to pass. It came to the knowledge of Set that Ra would consult with Horus, and it seemed to him that an opportunity was at hand to injure Horus. So he took upon himself the form of a black pig. Fierce was his aspect, his teeth were long and sharp, and his color was the blackness of the thundercloud. Savage and evil was his look, and struck fear into the hearts of men. Then came Ra to Horus and spoke to him, saying, "Let me look into your eyes, and behold what is to come." And he gazed into the eyes of Horus, and their color was that of the great green waters when the summer sky shines upon them. And while he gazed, the black pig passed by. Ra knew not that it was the evil god, and he cried out to Horus and said, "Look at that black pig. Never have I seen one so huge and so fierce." And Horus looked, neither did he know Set in this strange form, and thought it was a wild boar from the thickets of the north country. Thus he was off his guard, and unprotected against his enemy. Then Set aimed a blow of fire at the eye of Horus, and Horus shouted aloud with the pain of the fire, and raged furiously, and cried, "It is Set, and he has smitten me with fire on the eyes." But Set was no longer there, for he had run away, and the black pig was seen no more, and Ra cursed the pig because of Set, and said, "Let the pig be an abomination to Horus." And to this day, men sacrifice the pig when the moon is full, because Set, the enemy of Horus and the murderer of Osiris, took its form in order to injure Horus. And for this reason, pigs are unclean throughout the land of Egypt, and they may never enter the temples or sacrifice to the gods. And when the eyes of Horus were healed, Ra gave him the city of Pe. Horus was glad, and he rejoiced. And at the joy of Horus, the earth blossomed, and the thunderclouds and rain disappeared. The Egyptian religion was around for a very long time and had a huge following. Many of the myths have at least one different version. The differences in detail could either be very minor or very large. Egyptian mythology is a huge field, and it could take a whole lifetime to learn it all. Thanks for watching this episode of Mythstory on Egyptian mythology. Make sure to like and subscribe, and tell us what mythology you want us to cover next in the comments below. And if you really love us, consider supporting us on Patreon. We'll see you next time.